January 1944. The eastern edge of the Ukrainian steppe lies frozen under a pale winter sky. Snow settles into the folds of churned earth, filling boot prints, softening shell scars from battles already past. The air is unnaturally still. No rifle fire, no engines, only the distant creak of timber bunkers shrinking in the cold. German infantrymen stand in shallow trenches, scanning a horizon that offers no movement, no warning. They have endured artillery before, wild, thundering barrages that tore the land apart without rhythm or mercy. This feels different. The silence stretches too long. The earth itself seems to be waiting. Then the first shells arrive. Not scattered, not searching. They fall with order. Explosions erupt at measured intervals, each impact equidistant from the last. Rows of geysers punch upward in straight lines, advancing across the snowbound fields like marks drawn by an invisible ruler. Within minutes, the landscape becomes a checkerboard of craters, precise, evenly spaced, relentless. Veterans stare in disbelief. This is not chaos. This is design. As the guns continue, the realization settles into the trenches with a cold clarity. Somewhere beyond the horizon, maps are being followed to the meter. The ground beneath them has already been divided, calculated, and condemned. And this moment, this shock, was years in the making, rooted deep in how modern war learned to measure destruction. By the time German soldiers encountered artillery fire that fell in perfect geometric patterns, Europe had already lived under the shadow of mass guns for more than 3 decades. Artillery was not new to war, but what had changed, quietly, methodically, was the philosophy behind how it was used. The First World War had introduced industrialized killing on a scale never before imagined. Artillery caused the majority of casualties on every major front, yet its employment was crude by later standards. Guns fired by map reference, visual spotting, or sound ranging, often without precise coordination. Barrages were thunderous but wasteful. Entire days of shelling might precede an attack, warning defenders long before infantry moved. The battlefield was obliterated, but not necessarily controlled. German military thinkers absorbed these lessons deeply. During the interwar years, constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany focused on mobility, coordination, and speed rather than mass. Artillery remained important, but it was designed to support movement, not dominate terrain. Fire missions were expected to be flexible, reactive, and tied closely to advancing units. Chaos, not precision grids, was assumed to be the natural state of bombardment. This assumption followed German soldiers into the Second World War. Early victories reinforced it. In Poland, in France, and during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, German forces faced opponents whose artillery coordination often lagged behind their maneuver. Guns were powerful but slow to react. Fire fell where observers could see or where maps roughly indicated. The land was scarred, but patterns were irregular. Survivability came from experience, knowing how to read incoming fire, when to flatten against the earth, when to move. Yet beneath the surface, Allied armies, particularly the Soviet Union, Britain, and later the United States, were approaching artillery differently. For them, artillery was not merely support. It was structure. Between the wars, military engineers and mathematicians refined firing tables to unprecedented accuracy. Survey units mapped terrain down to the meter. Elevation, temperature, barrel wear, propellant variance, all were measured, recorded, and recalculated. Artillery units no longer needed visual contact with their targets. They needed coordinates. Once the map was trusted, the gun would follow it faithfully. This shift transformed the battlefield from a chaotic space into a plotted surface. The concept of the artillery grid emerged naturally from this logic. Large areas were divided into numbered squares, each corresponding to precise map references. Within those squares, fire could be ordered blindly, yet land with deadly reliability. Guns miles apart could strike simultaneously. Shells could arrive not in waves, but in patterns. German intelligence knew of these developments in theory. Reports filtered back from Spain during the Civil War. Observations came from early encounters with Soviet artillery in 1941. But doctrine and expectation lagged behind reality. German officers still viewed artillery primarily as a reaction tool, something to suppress or respond, not something that could sculpt the battlefield in advance. That gap widened as the war dragged on. By 1942 and 1943, the industrial scale of the conflict began to assert itself fully. Factories replaced craftsmanship. Quantity overtook finesse. Allied artillery units grew in number, in ammunition supply, and in organizational depth. Fire planning was no longer done hours before an attack. It was prepared days in advance, with multiple contingencies layered atop one another. For German soldiers at the front, the early signs were subtle. Bombardments lasted longer. Barrages lifted and returned with eerie regularity. Craters appeared in rows rather than clusters. Entire defensive zones vanished not through random destruction, but systematic erasure. Still, few fully grasped what they were witnessing. Because to understand why artillery could carve the land into perfect grids, one had to look beyond the trenches, to the quiet rooms where maps were unfolded, rulers aligned, and entire landscapes were reduced to numbers. And it was there, far from the noise of the guns, that modern artillery truly became a science. Behind every barrage that struck with mathematical regularity was a system that prized preparation over improvisation. By the middle years of the war, Allied artillery doctrine had evolved into something closer to an industrial process than a battlefield reaction. Fire was no longer shaped by what could be seen. It was shaped by what had already been measured. Survey units were the quiet foundation of this transformation. Long before frontline troops arrived, engineers moved through contested or recently secured terrain with tripods, optical instruments, and calibrated chains. They measured distances, elevations, and angles with obsessive care. Rivers, ridgelines, villages, and road junctions were fixed in space with numerical certainty. These measurements were transferred on standardized maps shared across units, corps, and entire armies. Once a gun's exact position was known and the target grid fixed, line of sight became irrelevant. Fire control centers coordinated the process. Using firing tables refined through years of testing, officers could calculate the precise elevation and bearing required for each gun. Temperature, humidity, air density, and barrel were all factored in. Corrections were applied automatically. The gun crews did not need to understand the mathematics. They only needed to follow the numbers. This is how artillery learned to draw lines across the earth. One of the most decisive developments was the mastery of predicted fire. Unlike earlier methods that relied on spotting rounds to adjust aim, predicted fire allowed guns to strike without warning. The first shell was no longer a ranging shot. It was a kill shot. When dozens or hundreds of guns fired simultaneously using predicted data, the effect was devastating. Entire areas could be saturated before defenders had time to react. The grid system amplified this power. Battlefields were divided into squares, each assigned a code. Fire orders referenced these codes rather than landmarks. A command could erase one grid, then the next, methodically advancing destruction like a moving wall. To the men under it, the barrage felt unnaturally ordered. To the planners, it was simply procedure. Nowhere was this approach more fully embraced than on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, having absorbed catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, rebuilt its doctrine around overwhelming firepower. Soviet artillery formations grew immense. Entire divisions were supported by mass gun armies. Fire plans were rehearsed in detail, sometimes using sand tables to visualize terrain. Timetables were synchronized down to the minute. When the guns opened, they did not search for targets. They executed plans. German defensive doctrine struggled to keep pace. German artillery remained professional and lethal, but ammunition shortages, fuel constraints, and air interdiction increasingly limited its effectiveness. Observation posts were destroyed. Communication lines were severed. Counter-battery fire became difficult when enemy guns fired briefly, accurately, and then shifted. Most unsettling of all was the psychological effect. German soldiers were trained to endure shelling by reading its rhythm. Randomness could be survived. Patterns could be learned. But grid fire removed intuition. The shells did not walk toward a position. They appeared everywhere at once, spaced evenly, leaving no safe gap to exploit. Trenches that might have survived scattered fire were neutralized simply because they occupied a plotted square. Western Allied forces refined the same principles with different emphases. British artillery emphasized central control and meticulous planning. American artillery focused on flexibility layered atop precision, allowing rapid massing of fire from dispersed units. Both relied on grids, maps, and coordination that German troops increasingly lacked the resources to disrupt. By late 1943, this disparity was undeniable at the front. Veterans reported barrages that seemed to draw boxes across the land. Defensive positions disappeared in orderly sequence. Entire companies were rendered combat ineffective without ever seeing an enemy soldier. The battlefield was no longer shaped by chance encounters. It was shaped by calculations made far beyond the reach of small arms. And as artillery fire became more deliberate, more patterned, and more absolute, it forced every participant in the war to confront a new reality. Victory would belong not just to those who fought bravely, but to those who could organize destruction with cold precision. That realization would soon collide with human endurance, leadership decisions, and moral limits, revealed most clearly through the different angles from which this phenomenon was experienced. For the German soldier at the front, artillery had always been the dominant presence on the battlefield, but never like this. Earlier barrages announced themselves through disorder. Shells landed unevenly, pauses opened and closed, and men learned, through experience rather than instruction, how to survive inside that chaos. Grid artillery erased that understanding. It replaced uncertainty with something far more unsettling: certainty without mercy. The first indication came not from noise, but from pattern. As the barrage unfolded, explosions did not cluster randomly or walk across the terrain. They appeared evenly spaced, forming lines that advanced with mechanical patience. Craters mirrored one another in distance and depth. Fields, tree lines, and trench systems were treated identically, as if the landscape itself had lost identity. German soldiers quickly realized that the shells were not responding to them. They were ignoring them. This realization struck at the core of frontline psychology. Training emphasized initiative, adaptability, and reading the enemy's intent. Grid bombardment offered no intent to read. There was no probing fire, no adjustment, no visible observer. The guns were firing blind and hitting exactly where planned. Men were forced to accept that somewhere far beyond the horizon, their position had already been fixed on a map. Fear did not erupt immediately. It settled. The sense of being targeted gave way to the sense of being included. Included in a calculation. Included in a square. Veterans later described the strange, emotional shift that followed. When survival depends on action, fear sharpens. When survival depends on coordinates, fear dulls into resignation. This resignation did not mean collapse. German discipline remained strong. Units held their positions. Orders were followed. But the emotional foundation of resistance weakened. Soldiers stopped believing that good judgment could save them. They stopped trusting the earth. Trenches became waiting rooms rather than defenses. The tactical consequences were immediate and profound. German defensive doctrine relied on elasticity. Frontline units were expected to absorb an attack, yield ground where necessary, and then counterattack once the enemy exposed themselves. Artillery was meant to disrupt this cycle, to pin the attacker while maneuver restored the line. Grid bombardment reversed that logic entirely. It disrupted the defense before it could move. Entire defensive sectors were suppressed simultaneously. Communication trenches were cut not because they were spotted, but because they existed within known coordinates. Command posts disappeared without ever transmitting a warning. Reserves, positioned according to doctrine, were neutralized before they could deploy. When the barrage lifted, what remained of German units often found themselves isolated, leaderless, and disoriented. This was not simply firepower. It was denial. Grid artillery denied time. It denied coordination. It denied initiative. The battlefield did not unfold through engagement. It unfolded through execution. German officers reported situations in which infantry assaults encountered little resistance, not because defenders lacked courage, but because they had already been dismantled as a system. Technology played a decisive role, but not in the way German soldiers expected. The guns themselves were familiar: howitzers, field pieces, heavy artillery that existed on both sides. The difference lay in how they were used. Surveying instruments fixed gun positions with exactness. Fire tables translated environmental variables into reliable corrections. Radios connected batteries into networks rather than isolated units. Artillery became less about metal and more about mathematics. German artillery officers recognized this shift with growing concern. They faced enemies who could mass fire without massing guns, who could achieve saturation without prolonged barrages, and who could repeat the process with relentless consistency. Counter-battery fire became increasingly ineffective against batteries that fired briefly, accurately, and then displaced according to plan. Leadership struggled to adapt. Commanders were forced into impossible choices. Holding ground invited systematic annihilation. Withdrawal ceded momentum and morale. Dispersal reduced casualties, but weakened cohesion. None of these options restored control. The enemy was no longer reacting to German decisions. German decisions were reacting to enemy fire plans. This erosion of control affected morale at every level. Junior officers found it harder to inspire confidence when they themselves could not explain why certain positions were destroyed while others survived. Orders began to feel symbolic rather than practical. Even experienced leaders sensed that the war had shifted beyond the realm where personal skill could alter outcomes. Perhaps most troubling was the moral dimension. Grid bombardment removed the illusion of reciprocity. In earlier fighting, danger felt mutual. You fired, and you were fired upon. Under grid fire, German soldiers felt acted upon rather than engaged. Death arrived without warning, without acknowledgement, without confrontation. It did not punish mistakes. It did not reward courage. It simply occurred. This did not make the enemy crueler. It made the war colder. The pattern destruction of land and life introduced a new psychological burden. Soldiers spoke of the battlefield as something already finished before they arrived. Resistance became endurance. Survival became passive. The human will, still present, was forced into a narrower space. These pressures, human resignation, tactical paralysis, technological imbalance, and moral dislocation, did not operate separately. They reinforced one another. Each barrage deepened the sense that the battlefield was no longer negotiated by those standing on it. And when these artillery grids were finally unleashed at full scale, they did more than prepare the way for attack. They decided the moment. If the first impact of grid artillery was felt in the trenches, its deeper influence unfolded at higher levels of command and across the wider moral landscape of the war. What appeared to the frontline soldier as inevitable destruction was, from above, the result of deliberate choices. Choices shaped by leadership doctrine, enemy adaptation, and an evolving understanding of what modern war demanded. From the leadership perspective, grid bombardment represented a hard-earned solution to an old problem: how to break a well-prepared defense without sacrificing entire formations. Allied and Soviet commanders had learned through painful experience that courage alone could not overcome entrenched positions. Attacks launched without overwhelming preparation ended in stalemate or disaster. Artillery grids offered predictability. They allowed leaders to reduce uncertainty before committing infantry and armor. Fire plans were constructed like blueprints. Timetables synchronized guns across vast distances. Barrages were layered. Counter-battery fire to silence enemy guns, suppression grids to pin defenders, and rolling barges to shield advancing troops. Commanders did not see this as impersonal destruction. They saw it as discipline imposed on chaos. Precision was viewed as a way to save lives on their own side, even if it meant devastating the ground ahead. For German leadership, this shift created a growing strategic dilemma. Intelligence reports confirmed the patterning of enemy fire, yet the resources required to match it were increasingly unavailable. Ammunition shortages, fuel scarcity, and Allied air superiority limited German artillery response. Defensive planning became reactive, focused on absorbing punishment rather than shaping engagements. Adaptation followed, but slowly and unevenly. Positions were dispersed. Units were ordered to dig deeper. Camouflage was emphasized. Yet, grid bombardment did not require visible targets. Dispersion reduced losses, but weakened cohesion. Deeper dugouts protected men, but trapped them beneath collapsing earth. Camouflage offered little defense against coordinates already plotted. The enemy perspective added another layer. Allied and Soviet gunners rarely saw the effects of their fire directly. They operated by calculation and confirmation, trusting reports rather than observation. This distance altered their relationship with violence. Destruction became abstract, measured in grids neutralized, objectives softened, schedules maintained. The battlefield was translated into data. Yet, even within this abstraction, limits were acknowledged. Fire plans were revised when civilians were present. Barrages were adjusted when friendly units advanced faster than expected. The system was rigid but not mindless. It reflected leadership decisions shaped by necessity rather than indifference. Morally, grid bombardment forced a confrontation with the nature of industrial war. The patterned craters etched into the landscape were evidence of control, but also of scale. War had become something executed by organizations rather than individuals. Responsibility diffused upward and outward, spread across planners, engineers, commanders, and politicians. For German soldiers, this diffusion was deeply unsettling. There was no enemy face to curse, no single gun to silence. The violence came from everywhere and nowhere. It challenged older notions of honor and reciprocity that still lingered in military culture. Survival depended less on valor and more on chance. As these realities set in, the battlefield itself began to change character. Terrain no longer evolved through fighting. It was redesigned through fire. Villages vanished in grids. Forests were stripped into stumps and lines of craters. Maps had to be redrawn, not because of maneuver, but because the land no longer resembled itself. By the time the great barges of the later war arrived, the transformation was complete. Artillery had ceased to be merely a supporting arm. It had become the primary author of the battlefield. And when the guns finally opened at full strength, the patterns they imposed would mark the decisive turning point, where calculation met consequence and theory became irreversible reality. The turning point did not announce itself with movement. It arrived with timing. In the early hours before dawn, whether on the frozen plains of the Eastern Front or the rain-darkened fields of Western Europe. The front lines lay deceptively quiet. German units reported nothing unusual. No probing patrols, no artillery registration, no visible buildup. To veterans, the absence of warning was itself unsettling, but there was nothing to engage, nothing to respond to. Then, at a precisely chosen minute, the guns opened. There was no ranging fire, no gradual escalation. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of artillery pieces fired simultaneously, their shells crossing unseen in the dark. The first impact struck not the forward trenches but the depth behind them. Command posts vanished. Communication nodes were erased. Roads and junctions disappeared beneath overlapping explosions. Within seconds, the battlefield was severed from itself. This was not bombardment meant to terrorize. It was designed to dislocate. Grid after grid ignited in sequence. Each square of terrain received its assigned share of destruction, measured not by enemy movement, but by timetable. Shells fell at regular intervals, producing craters that aligned with eerie consistency. Observers later described the land as though it had been stamped repeatedly by an enormous mechanical press. German soldiers reacted as they had been trained. They took cover. They waited for the barrage to lift. But it did not lift in the way they expected. It advanced. Rolling fire followed the grid pattern forward, suppressing one belt of defense while the next was neutralized. Trenches collapsed. Dugouts filled with smoke and earth. Men emerging too early were cut down by fragments or blast. Those who waited too long found themselves buried alive. Survival became a contest against physics rather than tactics. Time lost meaning. Watches stopped. Orders could not be heard. Runners failed to return. Radios crackled once, then fell silent. Units ceased to function as units. They existed only as clusters of men enduring the same pressure. For commanders attempting to respond, the situation was already beyond recovery. Counter-battery fire was impossible without communication. Reserves could not move across ground that was itself under plotted fire. Even withdrawal routes were targeted in advance. The battlefield had been closed. This was the moment when artillery ceased to prepare the battle and instead decided it. When infantry assaults finally came, sometimes hours later, they encountered positions already hollowed out. Resistance, where it existed, was fragmented. Machine guns fired without coordination. Officers attempted to rally men who no longer knew where the line was. The defensive system had been broken before contact. The shock among German survivors was not simply fear. It was recognition. They understood that what they had faced was not improvisation, but execution. The land had been measured. The time had been chosen. The outcome had been shaped before the first shell fell. This realization marked the true turning point. From this moment forward, the war would be fought on terms defined by those who could impose order on destruction. And the guns were not finished. As dawn broke over the shattered landscape, the full scale of the assault became unmistakable. Smoke coiled from cratered fields, rising in thin gray plumes that mingled with the morning mist. Trenches, once carefully dug and reinforced, had been carved into linear hollows, evenly spaced and aligned with an almost mechanical regularity. What had once been defensive terrain now resembled a map rendered in 3 dimensions. Each crater a precise mark, each line a proof of calculation. German soldiers, emerging from whatever protection remained, felt the alien geometry of their own battlefield. Familiar reference points, the bend in a river, the ridge crest, the crossroads, were gone, swallowed beneath patterned destruction. In the midst of this orchestrated chaos, command structures struggled to survive. Battalion leaders, attempting to rally fragmented units, found themselves isolated. Officers who could have coordinated counterattacks or organized retreats were either trapped, killed, or cut off from subordinates by the very grids that defined the barrage. Orders, when shouted, were often meaningless. The men they were meant for had been relocated, dispersed, or annihilated before the message even reached them. Radios, relying on wire lines and directional antennas, faltered under systematic targeting. By the time any report arrived at higher headquarters, the terrain itself had been transformed. The infantry that followed the barrage was, in many ways, walking into a preordained corridor of success. Advancing across fields designed to be cleared by artillery, they encountered minimal organized resistance. Machine gun nests were destroyed, wire obstacles shredded, and strong points rendered ineffective. What remained were small pockets of determined defenders, disoriented and overwhelmed, attempting to regroup in fragmented dugouts or surviving shell holes. The battlefield had been pre-sculpted. Victory was embedded in its design. Yet this was not a simple triumph of firepower. The sheer complexity of the operation demanded perfection in planning and execution. Each battery, whether positioned miles from the front or behind the lines, had to adhere to its firing timetable with precision. Timing was measured down to the second. If a single unit fired too early or too late, the integrity of the grid would fracture. The result could be wasted ammunition, ineffective suppression, or even friendly fire incidents. Coordinators at artillery command posts monitored hundreds of firing units simultaneously, adjusting calculations for temperature, humidity, barrel wear, and propellant consistency. It was a system that blended mathematics with mechanics, precision with patience, and in that moment, the battlefield became the proving ground for its effectiveness. German soldiers who survived the first wave could scarcely comprehend the scale of the operation. Men reported hearing shells impacting in consistent, unrelenting succession, each explosion spaced almost rhythmically, as though the land were being methodically measured rather than assaulted. For those caught in the open, the results were catastrophic. Groups of men disappeared from observation entirely, swallowed by the blast and earth. Trenches that appeared untouched 1 minute could collapse the next. Survival, once a product of instinct and experience, became the province of chance. Even when the barrage lifted to allow infantry to advance, the psychological weight remained. Every man in a German unit was acutely aware that the enemy had already calculated his location. It was not mere gunfire. It was premeditated occupation of space. Fear was compounded by the awareness that retreat, if attempted, was equally dangerous. Withdrawal routes had been subjected to preliminary bombardment. Roads, tracks, and crossroads, the lifelines of maneuver, had been cratered and mined in advance. The very act of moving became a gamble against geometry and timing. From a tactical perspective, the battlefield had been transformed into a sequential death trap. The grids created corridors of destruction that funneled surviving forces into designated kill zones. Engineers and sappers could attempt to clear mines or wire, but they faced terrain continuously reshaped by explosive force. Defenders attempting to reorganize in secondary lines were often preempted by rolling barges, synchronized to arrive just as troops emerged from cover. Coordination between units became impossible under such conditions. Any attempt to regroup or counterattack was met with fire that was calculated, patient, and comprehensive. The human toll extended beyond immediate casualties. Soldiers reported a pervasive sense of helplessness, a cognitive strain as the battlefield no longer responded to action but enforced it. Survival was no longer earned through training or courage. It was dictated by whether one had been included or overlooked in the grid. Trenches offered no advantage. Escape routes were preordained, often leading into the next sector of planned bombardment. The mental calculus of existence, deciding when to move, when to lie low, how to conserve ammunition or energy, was rendered meaningless by the pre-measured patterns. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Amid this chaos, artillery command posts operated with terrifying efficiency. Observers, whether on distant ridges, in balloons, or in observation towers, transmitted coordinates with minimal delay. Surveyors ensured that even shifting terrain, previously battered fields, destroyed roads, or broken rail lines, could be recalibrated for the next sequence of fire. The entire operation became a loop of measurement, calculation, and execution. It was a system that treated the battlefield as a fixed geometry rather than a mutable environment shaped by human action. The German forces encountered not merely an enemy army, but an invisible architecture of war that anticipated, mapped, and neutralized resistance. Even the air war intersected with this moment. Reconnaissance planes confirmed target grids and corrected minor deviations. Spotters reported from observation balloons tethered behind the lines. Anti-aircraft artillery remained focused elsewhere, leaving sky observers free to adjust calculations and ensure that each shell landed precisely where predicted. The integration of air, land, and communication networks made the barrage comprehensive. It was impossible to isolate any single element for attack or countermeasure. The battlefield was fully systematized. When infantry engaged the survivors of the bombardment, the effect was nearly total. Units that had endured until then were disoriented, fragmented, and often leaderless. Machine gun positions, artillery remnants, and communication nodes had been destroyed with precise timing. German soldiers attempted to organize counterattacks or emergency positions, but their efforts were piecemeal and ineffective. The battlefield had been predetermined. Human initiative could not reverse the design. Commanders later admitted in reports that entire regiments ceased to function cohesively, their cohesion broken before the first round of infantry fire reached the line. By mid-morning, the scope of the assault became fully evident. The land itself had been altered, reshaped into craters and disrupted earth, forming geometric patterns that could be read like a schematic. Villages had been leveled according to grids, artillery emplacements rendered in lines, supply paths turned into obstacle courses. German resistance was scattered, unable to mount organized defense. The precision of the fire allowed advancing forces to exploit the predictable weaknesses, moving forward in a controlled, almost surgical manner. Casualties, while severe, were magnified by psychological collapse as much as by physical destruction. The climactic realization, shared across surviving German units, was as much intellectual as emotional. They were not facing random destruction, but the execution of a plan designed in advance, calculated in detail, and implemented flawlessly. Every crater, every obliterated position, every disrupted trench bore witness to the precision of modern artillery warfare. The human instinct to read the battlefield, to react and adapt, had been neutralized. Soldiers were forced to accept that, in this moment, mathematics and coordination had triumphed over valor and experience. As the day wore on, the battlefield became a study in contrasts. The guns, now silenced after their scheduled cycles, left behind an eerie calm. Fields resembled checkerboards of destruction. Smoke still rose from deep craters. Survivors crawled from broken positions to assess what remained. Corpses and wreckage marked the invisible lines of grids, revealing the meticulous orchestration that had determined the day. Where once maps had been static, the terrain now confirmed the effectiveness of calculated fire. The German front had been methodically dismantled, leaving no ambiguity about the outcome. This climax of artillery grid warfare did more than break positions. It shattered the mental framework of soldiers, the operational flexibility of commanders, and the integrity of defensive doctrine. It proved beyond doubt that the modern battlefield could be reshaped according to calculation, that victory could be imposed before the first hand-to-hand encounter. The human, tactical, and technological elements of warfare had intersected in a singular moment where preparation, precision, and execution became absolute. And from this juncture, the consequences would ripple outward, informing strategic decisions, altering the flow of entire campaigns, and redefining how armies measured the power of artillery. The turning point had been reached. The grid had spoken, and the battlefield obeyed. The smoke had barely lifted when the true scale of the devastation became visible. Craters, perfectly aligned and stretching across miles, scarred the landscape like a mechanical etching. The snow or mud between them was churned into churned soil and ice, making movements slow and treacherous. Trenches had been leveled, strong points flattened, and the defensive network that German forces had relied upon for months, or even years, had been erased with systematic efficiency. Where once a ridge or tree line offered cover or concealment, there was now only exposed earth, perforated with fire-scarred craters. Roads were rendered unusable, torn open by repeated shell impacts. Rail lines, carefully maintained and critical for supplies, had been bent, twisted, or shattered along predetermined axes. In a matter of hours, the battlefield had been transformed into a mosaic of destruction, its geometry dictated by artillery grids rather than natural or human logic. Survivors emerged from the wreckage shell-shocked, their eyes registering the patterns with a mixture of disbelief and terror. German infantrymen, even hardened veterans, walked across the fields as if entering an alien landscape. Every step revealed further evidence of the precision behind the attack. Adjacent craters aligned perfectly, machine gun nests destroyed exactly where they had been mapped, trenches obliterated in rows that could only have been planned. It was not randomness. It was not chance. It was orchestration, and the realization weighed heavily on every man who had endured it. Casualties were immense, both immediate and indirect. Units reported that entire companies were rendered combat ineffective not by concentrated fire on a single position, but by systematic neutralization of multiple grids simultaneously. Leaders were lost, squads were disorganized, and communications were shattered. Many soldiers who survived the initial bombardment were left to navigate a chaotic battlefield alone, exposed to follow-up fire or forced to negotiate cratered terrain under enemy observation. Medical teams, already overtaxed, struggled to reach the wounded. Field hospitals became overwhelmed within hours, as men suffering from shrapnel wounds, fractures, and concussions arrived in waves, often with no clear reference for where they had been hit or by which artillery battery. The psychological impact mirrored the physical devastation. German soldiers reported a pervasive sense of futility and disorientation. Traditional survival skills, reading the sound of incoming fire, predicting shell patterns, identifying the safest terrain, were no longer reliable. The battlefield had been mapped, measured, and assigned before they even arrived, leaving them with little control over outcomes. Many recounted the emotional strain of walking across fields, knowing that every step had been calculated to maximize risk. Fear became constant, inescapable, and deeply personal, reinforced by the observation that some positions had survived entirely untouched, while others, often only a few meters away, were obliterated. Commanders attempted to regain a semblance of control, but their efforts were limited by the very design of the artillery grids. Communication lines had been severed, observation posts destroyed, and runners killed or delayed. Attempts to organize counterattacks often failed before they began, as units could neither assemble nor advance across terrain that had been thoroughly pre-saturated with fire. Even when German officers tried to reinforce positions or move reserves, they found themselves navigating a landscape deliberately reshaped to prevent maneuver. The precision of the artillery grids meant that defensive adjustments were constantly one step behind. The battlefield itself dictated action, leaving leaders reacting rather than directing. From the technological perspective, the success of the grid systems became painfully evident. Survey teams, fire control officers, and forward observers had coordinated their efforts to achieve effects that traditional artillery could not. Each battery had fired according to meticulously calculated timing, and the cumulative impact demonstrated that artillery was no longer a mere support tool. It had become a decisive instrument capable of shaping entire battles. German units, reliant on flexibility, improvisation, and rapid counter-battery response, found themselves outmatched not by superior firepower alone, but by superior organization and calculation. Beyond the immediate tactical results, the aftermath revealed the logistical consequences of such precision. Supply chains were disrupted not just by direct bombardment, but by the obliteration of roads, railways, and depots. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies could not reach units trapped in cratered terrain. Attempts to reroute through secondary paths were complicated by the systematic targeting of likely alternative routes. Even engineering units, tasked with clearing obstacles, struggled to keep pace with the scale and precision of destruction. The battlefield had become a fluid, lethal obstacle course, where the enemy's plan continued to operate even after the guns fell silent. The human cost extended to morale and cohesion. German units reported fragmented communication, delayed orders, and inability to coordinate movements. Soldiers were forced to operate in isolation, often unaware of the positions or intentions of nearby comrades. Commanders noted that units previously effective in small-scale engagements were rendered ineffective when confronted with pre-calculated, large-scale destruction. Veterans described the feeling of walking into a predetermined trap, where survival depended less on experience or valor and more on chance and timing. The dislocation of human expectation from battlefield reality created confusion, fear, and a profound sense of helplessness. Strategically, the effectiveness of grid bombardment forced a re-evaluation of German defensive doctrine. Commanders acknowledged that traditional approaches, holding linear defensive lines, relying on trenches and dugouts, and maintaining predictable reserves, were increasingly vulnerable to methodically planned artillery. Units were forced to disperse, seek deeper cover, and abandon established fortifications, often at the cost of cohesion and operational flexibility. Even temporary successes in resisting the infantry advance could not undo the damage already inflicted by the artillery grids. Across surviving German forces, a grim realization emerged. The battlefield was no longer neutral ground. It had been pre-measured, pre-targeted, and, in effect, predetermined. Artillery had become not a supporting weapon, but the arbiter of survival. Men no longer fought merely against an enemy army. They contended with a system of destruction designed to erase initiative and impose control over chaos. Trenches, machine gun positions, and even strong points were neutralized by a combination of mathematics, observation, and timing. The war had shifted, and the consequences of that shift were immediate, brutal, and unmistakable. In reports filed in the days after the bombardment, German officers attempted to quantify the destruction. Battalions were rendered ineffective, reserves delayed or destroyed, and critical communication nodes eliminated. Crater fields were measured and mapped, revealing the precision of the grid system. Casualty rates were high, with both wounded and killed disproportionately affected by their position within the mapped grids rather than by exposure or error. The destruction was measured not only in lives lost, but in the erosion of defensive capability, the fragmentation of units, and the systemic disruption of operational planning. Even those who survived faced a secondary challenge, navigating the terrain left behind. Fields transformed into craters, mud, and ice made movement laborious, and surviving fortifications offered little protection from follow-up attacks. Engineers and sappers attempted to restore roads and clear obstacles, but the sheer scale of destruction slowed recovery. Every reconstructed position risked becoming the target of the next pre-calculated barrage. The battlefield itself had become a weapon, a layered system of lethal architecture, waiting for the next cycle of planning and execution. In the aftermath, German soldiers and commanders alike understood that a new reality had been imposed on them. The battlefield was no longer a place of improvised defense and reaction. It had become a surface measured, mapped, and designed. Artillery had shifted from support to decision-maker, dictating the tempo of engagements, the location of casualties, and the course of the fighting. Human initiative, once a critical factor in defense, had been constrained by a system operating on precision, timing, and calculation. The landscape, scarred with craters and aligned with invisible grids, bore witness to the operational philosophy that had turned terrain into a preordained instrument of war. This realization had immediate implications for subsequent operations. German units, already strained by losses, logistical shortfalls, and manpower shortages, were forced to reconsider defensive doctrine. The experience demonstrated that traditional fortifications, linear trench networks, and predictable positioning could no longer reliably protect men. Units began to adopt dispersal, concealment, and deeper defensive positions where possible, but each adaptation came with trade-offs in cohesion, mobility, and command efficiency. The psychological impact on soldiers was equally profound. Knowing that survival depended on arbitrary placement within a pre-calculated grid created stress and eroded confidence, affecting performance in future engagements. The aftermath of the grid bombardment also reverberated at the strategic level. High Command recognized the need to either neutralize the enemy's artillery advantage or compensate through technological and logistical improvements. Counter-battery operations, intelligence gathering, and operational planning were adjusted to address the reality of premeditated, precision fire. Yet these adaptations were limited by industrial constraints, ammunition shortages, and increasingly dominant air superiority by Allied forces. The systemic advantage provided by grid-based artillery would continue to shape the battlefield long after the immediate engagement had ended. In sum, the first wave of destruction left a clear pattern. The battlefield itself had been weaponized, human initiative had been subordinated to calculation, and traditional defensive doctrine had been shattered. Craters and leveled positions stood as testimony to the new logic of war. That victory could be imposed in advance through coordination, timing, and sheer precision. German soldiers survived where they could, retreated where they must, and began to comprehend that the next engagements would be fought not only against men, but against a methodical system of destruction operating on a scale previously unimaginable. In the weeks following the bombardment, the battlefield remained a silent testament to calculated destruction. Fields pocked with perfect craters became difficult or impossible to traverse, slowing troop movements and complicating the redeployment of German forces. Where supply convoys could once move with predictable efficiency, they now faced terrain designed to channel, delay, or destroy. Engineers labored to fill craters, repair roads, and restore bridges, but the sheer scale of destruction, coupled with ongoing artillery harassment, rendered these efforts only partially effective. Movement had become hazardous, slow, and uncertain, reinforcing the psychological weight on soldiers who had survived the initial barrage. The systemic disruption extended beyond the physical. German units attempting to regroup found that command hierarchies had been fractured. Battalion and company commanders were often casualties of the precise bombardment or isolated from subordinates. Decisions at the regimental level were compromised by incomplete reports, fragmented units, and terrain that no longer aligned with pre-war maps. The enemy's methodical targeting had effectively neutralized the German ability to coordinate large-scale responses. What remained was a series of fragmented, disjointed reactions, leaving soldiers to rely on instinct and luck rather than command. Morale continued to suffer. Veterans and newly conscripted troops alike reported an unsettling sense that their survival depended less on skill or courage and more on chance. Men spoke of walking across cratered fields, unsure whether the next shell would strike their position. The randomness imposed by the grid, though calculated in advance, felt indiscriminate to those on the ground. Even disciplined units found cohesion difficult to maintain. Acts of bravery were overshadowed by the realization that effort alone could not prevent destruction. The mental strain imposed by this new form of warfare was cumulative, affecting not only immediate performance, but the confidence of troops in future engagements. At the strategic level, German high command began to internalize the broader implications. Linear defensive doctrines, previously considered reliable, were now vulnerable to systematic pre-planned artillery. Commanders emphasized dispersal, deeper dugouts, and alternate routes of movement to mitigate vulnerability, yet resource constraints, limited artillery, manpower shortages, and fuel scarcity prevented comprehensive adaptation. Supply lines remained fragile, and reserves could rarely be deployed where needed. Grid bombardments had revealed a growing gap between traditional doctrine and the operational realities of modern, systematized artillery warfare. The moral and psychological consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers and commanders alike grappled with the knowledge that their positions, and by extension their lives, could be predetermined targets. The concept of combat honor and reciprocity, so ingrained in military culture, was challenged by destruction that was both impersonal and precise. German soldiers were forced to reconcile with a battlefield in which initiative could be negated by meticulous planning and the cold arithmetic of fire tables. This ethical dislocation further compounded the already severe stress of combat. In the aftermath, operational lessons were assimilated slowly. German planners recognized the importance of mobility, depth, and concealment. Defensive lines became more dispersed. Reserves were positioned with greater caution, and efforts were made to obscure fortifications from observation. Yet even these measures were reactive, constrained by ongoing shortages and the continuous pressure of enemy artillery. The grid system had introduced a level of precision and coordination that could not be fully countered without substantial changes to doctrine, technology, and logistics, changes that were difficult to implement mid-conflict. Ultimately, the battlefield had been transformed physically, operationally, and psychologically. Terrain, once a factor to be exploited or defended, had been weaponized. Command, once a tool for control, had been challenged by premeditated precision. Morale, once sustained by courage and experience, was now tested by the realization that human initiative could be insufficient against a system of destruction. The implications were profound. Survival and success depended increasingly on adaptation to new methods of calculated, systemic warfare. For the German army, the aftermath of the grid bombardments marked both a tactical and philosophical turning point, underscoring the growing dominance of precision, preparation, and planning in modern conflict. The battlefield lay quiet now, scarred by the precise marks of calculated fire. Craters etched in perfect grids stretched across fields and villages, a lasting testament to the scale and method of modern warfare. What had begun as a contest of courage, strategy, and improvisation had become a confrontation with mathematics, timing, and coordination. Survival was no longer determined solely by skill or valor, but by the invisible design imposed on the land. The human spirit endured, yet was tested in ways that were unprecedented, reminding us that war is as much about systems and preparation as it is about men. For the soldiers caught in the path of grid artillery, the experience was disorienting, terrifying, and transformative. Those who survived carried the memory of terrain reshaped by unseen hands, of comrades lost in perfectly measured sequences, and of a sense of helplessness against a force both relentless and precise. Yet even amidst this destruction, they adapted, moved, and endured. The human capacity to persist in the face of overwhelming odds remained a constant, a quiet counterpoint to the mechanized precision around them. At the operational level, the bombardments reshaped doctrine, strategy, and perception of warfare. Commanders learned that preparation could dictate outcomes before engagement, that artillery was no longer merely support, but a decisive instrument, capable of orchestrating victory with astonishing accuracy. German forces, and all who would face similar systems, were forced to reconsider how they fought, where they positioned troops, and how they balanced courage with calculation. Modern warfare, it became clear, demanded anticipation, planning, and understanding of the enemy as a system, not just as men. Ultimately, the craters and level positions left behind were more than destruction. They were lessons inscribed upon the land. They demonstrated that human life, terrain, and effort could be measured, predicted, and manipulated by precision and coordination. And yet, amidst these cold calculations, the human element persisted: adaptation, courage, and endurance, reminding history that even in the most mechanized forms of war, humanity remained at its core. The lessons of grid artillery would echo through strategy, doctrine, and memory, a testament to the power of preparation, the weight of consequence, and the enduring resilience of those who fought.